All right, so I heard from my little finger that we are talking about portfolio today.
Littlefinger, is that a Game of Thrones reference?
It's a French, I don't know, it's a French saying. Is that, do you
Really?
have one here?
What is the French saying?
Oh, my little finger told me.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that an American saying? I've not heard that before. That would make sense for Littlefinger.
That's how I always understood it.
I didn't know that.
Oh, well, you just learned something. You're very welcome. What else you want to know?
That makes sense. I could never figure out why they call
It's
them
like, ooh, my little finger.
Right. So yeah, today we're covering portfolios. How to make a portfolio. All right, so today we are talking about portfolios and how to make one. Specifically, how to design and create a portfolio for getting hired. And I think that's an important statement to make because that basically frames the entire conversation and how you go about making a portfolio. So what we're talking about today is specifically to get a job, which is different from, let's say, just making a beautiful object or a beautiful booklet, right?
Yes, and also, you know, making a difference between all of the different types of portfolio.
Yeah.
And also, I think, you're right. It's important to make this distinction because there is several types of portfolios. The portfolios for which, you would do to apply to school, portfolio after you graduate. Portfolio. No, but like client portfolio is a completely different thing than a portfolio to get a job. So
and I think it's on a basic level. I think a lot of us as designers have these assumptions about what a portfolio should be, and we are perhaps at times too concerned or focus too much effort on the beauty of it, which is important, but we forget that this is basically. The portfolio is tasked with a very specific job. So to that end, this portfolio, the physical one, is going to be used and viewed in a number of ways. The first is that on the screen, potentially, we're going to get into that, potentially on the screen, it'll be viewed as it's sitting on a partner's desk, right? The person that's in charge of hiring is going to sit on their desk, potentially. That's one location. The other one is that it's going to be passed around within the office, carried around in book bags, and then also it's going to be used by you at your interview. Every single interview I've ever been at, I think this goes for everyone else in architecture, you have your portfolio, your physical portfolio. It's just on the desk between you and the person across from you, the person doing the interviewing, and you look at their work, right? So those are actually really important things to understand, that those are the only scenarios where the physical portfolio will mean anything, right? And from those scenarios is how we work backwards to decide what it should be. The other big question is I think you should have some kind of design intent or concept or approach to the portfolio itself that will meet all of the requirements I just listed, but also make it unique, right? There needs to be some kind of approach to it, right? So we made a list of fairly straightforward issues to go over. The first one is the format of the portfolio itself, the size of it, let's say.
The size of it. Wow. It would be really funny to see like portfolio where it's like, like the size of like a Harry Potter, like Bible book, like the giant one where you need two hands to flip a page. That would be awesome.
Okay, good.
If you want to work for me, yes, send me your Bible portfolio.
So yeah, in terms of the booklet size, big or small, I think the pros of having a large one is that you can do really large graphics, which is pretty sweet, but there are definitely negatives to it if you get too big. One is just the convenience of carrying this thing around.
That's what she said.
Okay. I'm going to carry this thing around. One is is carrying it around, which sounds like a really dumb, pragmatic, simple thing that's not glamorous, but it's the truth. And if you're living in a place like New York City, for example, where you're going to be going from interview to interview, this is something you have to consider, right?
Or even if you're just mailing it to people.
Right, and the cost of mailing it.
If it's a big envelope and if it's heavy, it's going to become expensive.
And if you're trying to send out 20, that's maybe you can send out 20 that are smaller and that are just as effective in size. Whereas if you did like a giant one, you could only send out a few, right?
And actually, that also brings the point of budget, right? I feel like you should allocate a pretty decent budget. You shouldn't try to do a cheap portfolio if you really want to get a job in the office of your dream, right? You really need to allocate a little chunk so you have the wiggle room to do something that's nice.
And I think also, I mean, I've been to a number of portfolio classes, and sometimes they recommend designing things so you stand out, which is true, but I think there are limitations to that. So, like in one class, I had heard, for example, like someone made their resume out of a weird paper that was extra big, so it stuck out of all the papers, so they would be viewed. Like, I kind of get that it's cute and it's kind of it's a one-trick pony. Personally, I just find it annoying, and so you have to also consider that the partner who's going to be doing the hiring, if it's a physical thing that he has with him and he does carry it around, which is kind of unlikely, but if that happens, convenience is a factor. And you don't want any of the portfolio design, the format of the portfolio, the binding, et cetera, to overshadow their work. You don't want it to become about the portfolio, in my view. Obviously, if you go too small, that's an issue because we are in a graphic profession and the pages need to be big enough to see things. So I tend to advocate for keeping it within the 8.5 by 11 realm. Around that size is good. I don't think you need to do an 11 by 17, pages. I think that's too large. And I think at the 8.5 by 11 size, you can still do, when you open it up, right, that ends up being 11 by 17, you can still do large graphics, and that's plenty big for desktop viewing, right?
I mean, you could definitely use the double page, if you want a big image.
And I've seen portfolios that go smaller, and they do square sizes, which I'm kind of opposed to, that are, let's say, 9 by 9 or 8 by 8. 8 by 8, that's getting a little bit crammed, and and at that size, it's again, to me, it almost becomes too cute, Well,
I think it puts you in the position where people might be like, oh, this person is not so sure of themselves, like maybe a lack of confidence, or, I think if you don't want to be bold, you don't want to be shy either. You kind of want to be in between. So just stick to a standard format.
And at the beginning, I said that you should have an approach or a concept with it, right? And this is also parallel to how I've seen a lot of final reviews happen at schools. So sometimes it's a simple pinup, other times it's a huge exhibition, it's a huge custom thing, right? Because as architects, we're questioning everything, and we're questioning how pinup should happen, and we're questioning what a book should be. And my book is going to be 6 inches by 6 inches and 3 inches thick. This is my concept for a book. That's great. But again, at some point, I think all this stuff is distracting and detracts from the work itself. And ultimately, you want the person to see the work, which is the gateway to you as a person and your skill set, et cetera, and not be fussing with this custom thing, right? So these are things to keep in mind. And also, the smaller you go, the more difficult it is to include legible text. And the people that are reviewing these things might be on the older sides and on the older side, and they don't want to have to view 6-point font, right? You have to keep the font legible, and this is a legitimate thing. Like, I think designers are trying to tweak things too often, and they scale down margins and scale down font size. Like, no, you need it to be really, really clear, because what eliminates a lot of portfolios from the next pile is just a lack of clarity, right? I'm not going to spend time trying to read something I can't read or look at something that's too difficult to look at.
It needs to be comfortable. You can't be annoyed by looking at it. Like, you don't want to. No, you know what I mean? Like, if it's like hard to read, or the font is funky, or the lines are too close to each other, or it's too much stuff, like you don't want to discourage your reader from going through the full portfolio. Yeah,
absolutely. The other question is orientation. Portrait, landscape, or square. Again, I kind of voiced my opinion about square. Portrait or landscape, either is fine. I don't think there's pros or cons. If you do a good layout, then it's a good layout, period, is my feeling. I tend to prefer landscape, but that's just me.
I prefer portrait, but that's just me.
Okay, well, that's incorrect. That's an incorrect opinion. I respect it, but it's incorrect. Why portrait?
I don't know. I like it. I mean, I could There is, I don't know, I just like it. No, the concept of my portfolio was to be more of a magazine type. So I went vertical.
Vertical. I like the horizontal because when you flip it, it's much more of a procession is not the right word, but it's much more of a task to do, and you really get the sense that you're flipping from page to page. And I like the idea that you get a long format, very wide viewing.
Yeah, what I don't like about it is that if you put an image, that you want a little bigger on an horizontal page, you're gonna be left off with a tiny chunk that you can't really do much with.
And if you know what you're doing in layout,
so if you use two vertical, you could have an horizontal and still have some space below and stuff. So it depends.
Debatable.
Oh yeah, I win.
Okay, moving on to the exterior, but this time moving on to the cover. So I wrote down highly unique packaging. I think. I think the sophisticated packaging of a portfolio was always my dream. I think I always wanted to design, like a very beautiful box in which my portfolio sits perfectly, and I handcrafted it all myself, and it presents itself as a gift to the person who's going to receive it, and project the ideal portfolio. But first, I don't have the time or money to do that. Yeah. And then if you apply to 300 places, you can really, it's not feasible, right? And then you kind of if you do something like that, you really have to have some serious stuff in your portfolio. Yeah. Right. You can't let the people opening the box down when they get into what you actually do for a living. Yeah, the packaging, I think the relationship between the packaging and the content has to be appropriate and well balanced and understood. This is parallel to like when students get up to present at the final review, they should wear something nice, but they always get one student who wears the equivalent of a tuxedo and their work sucks. It's like, all right, well, you've actually dug yourself a bigger hole. And it's the same thing with the portfolio. And again, I think the exterior needs to stand out enough so when it's sitting on a desk amongst all the other portfolios, it shines and you see it and you want to look at it, but it also doesn't want to kind of overstate itself. And also, I think there is something about the exterior communicating who you are what kind of expert you are, which is presumably in architecture and not graphic design, and also maybe even your age and skill set. So let me put it this way. I think that if you were a much older architect in our audience, let's say for now is on the younger side, if you're a much older architect and you had done 10 serious large projects across the world, right? I can guarantee you would not spend a lot of time doing some kind of weird custom packaging thing that's made out of, found beechwood that you sanded down to make a cut. Like you wouldn't do that, very likely. You would just put pictures of these giant projects, put the square footages and a description, and that would be it, right? And I say that because, on the other hand, if you are a young designer and you put all this effort into the exterior packaging, it could be read like, all right, well, how old is this person? How much time and effort do they spend doing this book? Are they an architect with experience, or am I going to deal with some undergrad student? Because it looks like this was done by a second-year undergrad student who had nothing else to do with his time, right? I'm not saying this is the only way the special portfolios can be read, but I think it's one possibility, and I think it's one that has to be acknowledged because I think ageism in our profession is a big issue, and being taken seriously by interviewers is a real struggle if you're fresh out of school. It's really difficult, right? So in that way, having the portfolio appear quote unquote professional, which is a weird term, but professional is not necessarily the worst thing, right? Because you're in a way you're stating like, let's talk about architecture, let's talk about buildings. This is what I've done inside the portfolio is what matters. I don't really care to talk about found wood on a beach that I sanded down to create the perfect cover, right? And that's also probably not why they're going to hire you. So looking mature in the portfolio is something you have to keep in mind.
I agree. The other thing too is that, like you were saying, there is printed portfolio, which is the one we just talked about. Mm-hmm. but your portfolio will also have a digital version of itself, right? And depending on which office you're applying to, they might get both, right? You might drop one off or mail one off and email it as well, because they're most likely going to ask you to do that anyway, right? So you can't rely on that beautiful packaging to be the reason why they are hiring you, because the digital won't have that.
Well, the digital, I think we should get into it later, but I don't think the thing that you send digitally is likely not the portfolio. It would be considered a work samples, right? But yeah, this is true. But what do you think about graphics on the cover?
I'm not a big fan. And the reason why is I'm not a graphic designer, and I don't want to pretend that I am. And the graphics I've seen on portfolio covers for architecture application oftentimes look the same. Meaning, it's like sinuous lines, like, this kind of like 3D, abstract, vortex graphics.
That's one. Can you name the other few?
I don't know, some weird shit logo that someone made up, but I have no idea what it means.
That's two.
Someone who says portfolio, okay, and that's it.
There's nothing wrong with saying portfolio on the front.
No, there is nothing wrong with that.
The third would be angled triangle stuff. So you have the curves, and you have angled stuff then, and the fourth now is collaging like weird shapes and things like this, right? And
abstraction.
Yeah.
But again, we're not visual artists or graphic designers, so I think I would kind of stay away from that unless you're really, really good at it, and that ties together with the work that is within the portfolio, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's different. I think I've definitely met architects that have majored in graphic design or have a minor in it. If that's the case, then and you feel like you can produce something really great that accurately reflects you and the portfolio, then fine, do that. But generally speaking, I've seen a lot of portfolios that have graphics on the exterior, and they're kind of crappy. And immediately, I'm not going to bother looking at that portfolio. If you can't even do a nice cover, I don't want to look at it. So if you feel very confident in your skill set in that way, fine. But if you're not 100% confident, then maybe you don't play that game, right? And also, I think that the phrase, judge a book by its cover is maybe overused, but it's also accurate and true. And, if you have 5 years of experience in your portfolio, that's a lot of stuff, hopefully, right? It's tough to find a cover that's going to appropriately match or balance with what's on the inside. And what you don't want to do is have a cover that's a huge turnoff before they even see the interior, the actual work that we really care about.
It's like, it's like the way you look like, the way you dress up.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want people to start having the wrong opinion about yourself based on how you dress up. It's the same way you dress up the cover of your portfolio. You don't want to, have people put you in a certain category before they even open it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if what I see in the cover is what I've seen before, as you described, this tells me something about the person already, that they're following a certain school of thought that I've already seen from these institutions or whatever it might be. The other thing, too, is the interior of the portfolio is ever changing and evolving. Either actually, because you're going to insert new projects, or even if you don't change the inside, the projects, when they're in a portfolio, they seem to evolve over time with you, even though they haven't changed at all, which sounds weird.
They seem to evolve over time.
Yeah, because your understanding of them evolves over time. Yeah, it's kind of wonky, but that's how I feel about it. Anyway, but there's a difference between the inside, which is going to be something that changes more often, and it's going to grow, and et cetera, versus the cover. And this is parallel to a conversation we had about including your own logo in a resume, how we didn't like it because it's like a brand.
So
and it's not graphically good a lot of times, but also it's too limiting. It's like it's capping growth. It's like saying, here is what I am exactly. And I think having graphics on the cover of portfolio is dangerous because it doesn't give breathing room to the stuff that's on the inside. Do you know what I mean, kind of?
Yeah, and ultimately, the firm who's looking to hire you, they want you to fit in their firm.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want to package it like, you are already something or somebody, because then they can project yourself,
Right. That's an interesting thing too. I think displaying a level of openness
and neutralism in a way.
Yeah, neutralism is really,
at least on the cover,
is really important. And that can be conveyed in a number of ways, and not just the portfolio, obviously, but that's definitely a critical thing, because when you get to the interview, or even before the interview, the portfolio is kind of like an interview without the person in a way. You don't want to show up super strong-handed in one direction that's very narrow-minded, because it's going to be a major turnoff to a lot of firms, right? Unless you're applying to an office that is in line with you, then that's one thing. But generally speaking, offices are eager to see someone who's talented, skilled, et cetera, but also someone that's going to be nice and easy to work with. And that, I think, some of that has to happen in the portfolio itself.
They need to see that you are able to adapt yourself, to a different situation or identity, or so without being like, too neutral and vanilla, have a little bit of personality here and there, but not sell that on the cover.
Yeah, it's a tough balance. Getting even more specific with binding, there's a bunch of different types of binding. The first would be perfect binding. I'm honestly not a huge fan of perfect binding.
I love perfect binding.
Oh, yes. Okay, why?
I love it. Why? Because it looks super clean. Mm-hmm. I like clean edges. Mm-hmm. But it looks nice when it's brand new. But if you go to an interview and you have one of the interviewer who's like annoyed by it and just like, smush it down so it stays open as he's looking at it, that's it. Just destroyed it.
Right.
So you kind of have to accept that.
Yeah, my issues I agree it's clean looking, but I tend to believe that the easy viewing of the stuff inside and the spreads and the work is more important than a clean binding system. So what I don't like about a lot of perfect bound books, especially if they get too thick, maybe above a 1/4 inch or so, I don't know, is that and depending on the size of the book, they're really hard to keep open. It's super annoying that you're meant to be looking at graphics or read text and you open it and it closes. You open and it closes. And the only way to open the thing and actually see the work clearly as it's meant to be viewed is to smash down the binding.
Or hold it with your 2 hands.
Yeah, but I don't want to do that. I'm lazy. And I think the interviewers are lazy. But you know what I'm talking about? Or people put the text too close to the inseam.
So that's the other thing. Then you get into more technical issues, which is like the spacing, the margins. Even if you need that much for the perfect binding, if it's open and it's not flat, you need to have the text and the image still visible, so you need to allow a little more.
Right.
So if you want to cram more stuff or bigger images on your portfolio, probably don't use that type of binding.
I don't like, you always have this curve thing, and maybe this stems from my haunting experience from high school. We have to read these giant textbooks and the text goes way in the fucking margins. You're like, I can't even read the text. This is dumb. And they have a picture of like a Native American, this one. I can't even see the Native American. It's so silly. So this is something to consider. But of course, if your portfolio is a smaller number of pages and it's big, then it's not as big as much of an issue, right? But if you're doing the 6x6 square thing that's 2 inches thick, no fucking way am I going to read this thing, And also I think there's a certain pace to how books are viewed, which is actually something we should talk about. So I think the portfolio is viewed at different speeds. The first speed would be 1 or 2 seconds to flip through it, to have it go from the first pile to the second pile.
Yeah, but you see, that's why the perfect binding is great. Like my portfolio, you can flip through like very easily. Yours, the pages are heavy, it's thick, you can't.
Right, so that's the first speed. And the thing is, you have to design the portfolio to work well at all of these speeds. So the 1 to 2 second speed, it needs to function greatly. The next level would be 3 to 10 seconds, right? Which is not very long. That's a different bracket of time to deal with, and the portfolio has to be designed to work there as well. And then lastly, you have the longer viewing, which is a minute, which is a long amount of time. and that would be for them if they're really actually going to sit down and read it before they meet you, which they won't, or if they're at the interview staring at one page. So you need to design with all of these three periods in mind. On that, I think the perfect binding lends itself to a flipping action, which I don't like, which is why I never did perfect binding.
I don't know, maybe... I mean, I've been hired with a perfect binding, so I think they're both fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is a different type of reading, and it's true that for an interview, being able to have the pages open flat so everyone around the table can see it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, huge difference.
But depending on what's the concept, how many pages, what's the thickness of the paper, the cover that you're using, it might be a big issue. It might not be such a big issue. It's kind of up to...
And actually, the interview setting is probably the most important scenario to think of when designing the portfolio, and useful one, which would therefore inform the binding, as you said, and also the size of the portfolio. Again, too small, it doesn't work at a table with 3 other people, and there might be 3 other people, right?
But also, they most likely would have looked at it already. It's kind of an excuse to start the conversation.
Maybe. But that's the thing too. You can't actually assume that they've seen the portfolio before they've arrived, because
sometimes they look at it when you come in.
yeah, and what happens very often is that so and so will be conducting an interview, and then at the last minute they're going to bring on 2 other people because they think maybe this person could fit on this team. Hey, Bob, do you want to join this interview? Yeah, I got half an hour. Let's go. They don't, and Bob, who might actually be the one who decides if you get hired, has not seen your resume, your CV, your face, your portfolio. Has no idea who you are, and so this is another kind of constraint or issues that you have to contend with in the portfolio itself. But going back to binding, there's spiral binding, wire O binding, and then custom binding. Spiral binding is the plastic, pig's tail thing. No. You're against it?
The plastic thing?
Yeah.
No, I mean, you should have dropped that off back in high school.
Yeah.
I would rather use a nice, like clip than using that. I use like 3 cute clips on the edges, and that's just bad. With the transparent thing in the front and like the weird blue backing.
I think spiral binding is a terrible thing to use. I think we are designers and we have to get past that. And you're right. It's like the typical high school book report with the plastic cover on it.
Like you're really proud of it. Like in high school when I was making reports like that, I was like, yeah, it looks legit. I know. Like you like pick the little horse, put the thing in.
If you want to go one step further, you could use giant Times New Roman font and say, this is my portfolio.
Put a picture of yourself on it.
It's just... It's kind of tacky and it's not very sophisticated and it's an incomplete and unfinished look, and it makes the quality of the portfolio and your work just seem not worthy really of being talked about. And
you get all kinds of fingerprints on that transparent sheet, which is disgusting.
The kind of binding that I use in my portfolio is the wire O binding, which functions like a spiral in that it allows you to open the book all the way up, but it's not a spiral form. I think it's like a clasp or something like that. And it comes in different colors, so you can find a color that works for you. And it's so for me at least, it hit the marks of making it easy to view, and they come in different sizes, the right color, and it's clean looking. It's not the spiral thing. And then custom binding could work, but again, I really think the threshold between a portfolio that screams out that this architectural designer spent too much time on the portfolio is a threshold you have to be mindful of with it. And if you start doing horsehair weaving, it's I don't know.
Horsehair. If the person's allergic, that's it. You're not hired.
The interesting thing about portfolios in general is that they provide full transparency to the person that created it, right? Would you agree?
In what way?
It's kind of in opposition to what we're saying, because we're describing how to create or design a portfolio. But at the end of the day, I think when you do create it, it's going to be a very accurate reflection of who you are and your skill set and etc. Assuming you actually did it and didn't have someone else do it for you.
I know that perfect binding reflects exactly how perfect I am.
And I think that's a fascinating thing, and I think that's also what's interesting about architecture projects anyway, is that when you see 15 different projects done by 15 different people, they are a reflection of what their interests are and who they are as a person at the end of the day. And the portfolio is that same way. And on the one hand, that's not good if you're a shitty designer because there's not much room to lie. On the other hand, that means that if you are, talented, skilled, dedicated, etc., it should come through. And I think a lot of times applicants are discouraged by the fact that the interviewer just flips through the portfolio. It's like, oh, I spent hundreds of hours on all these projects and the portfolio, and this fucker just flipped through it. Like, please, can we spend more time?
But but what really matters is that the portfolio actually got you to the interview. It doesn't matter so much that he's looking at it or not looking at it.
Yeah, this is true. And the other thing is that the interviewer, if they've seen a bunch of work and portfolios, they know pretty quickly whether or not they want to hire you, or for sure whether or not whether or not you go into pile 1 or pile 2, right? The finalists, let's say. It only takes a couple seconds, and now this person is not going to be with us, or this person will be with us. And it's a weird thought because I think architecture is a very complicated thing, and the projects we do are very sophisticated, especially if they're dealing with conceptual issues. Very, very complicated things, but it still only takes a couple seconds, 2 to 5 seconds before really whether or not you're going to want to talk to that person. And then the rest of whether or not you hire them probably comes from the interview more than anything else.
And how much you are willing to spend on them also comes from, I think, the interview.
Yeah. So that's the one thing with people viewing things quickly. So don't be discouraged if they do look at it quickly. It doesn't mean they aren't interested in you or don't have patience. It's probably just because they've done it a lot and they can tell, they see right through to who you are. So moving on to the interior.
Mm-hmm.
The number of pages. How many pages should we have in our portfolio?
Well, I think my first portfolio, probably, try to limit myself to a reasonable number of projects and therefore pages. My last one, though, was like, fuck that. I want to have as much room in the portfolio as I want to have them see things and spend time seeing certain things.
Right.
So I kind of dosed it, differently. Like, pages were full, or maybe it was one image once in a while. And I ended up having like a lot of pages, but again, my concept was being more of a magazine that they would enjoy, and want to see more and more and more of it, right?
Right. So you're thinking about pace and how long they're going to spend with it. I think there's a limit to how many pages you can include. I think, again, the reality is they're not going to look at the thing that long. They just won't. I mean, you can plan for that one opportunity where they might sit down with a cup of coffee and spend 5 minutes in the morning looking at your portfolio. But again, it only takes a few seconds before they know this pile or that pile. And when it gets to the second pile, the interview pile, then they're going to find out more about you at the interview. And I think the danger of having too many pages is, one, if you don't have a lot of work, don't play that game because it looks like you're stretching things too far.
Oh, yeah. No, you don't want to be that person.
You don't want to be that person. And anyone listening to this should understand that principle, right, of the quantity of information and how much you spread it out. It's the same thing when you're doing boards. If you have the potential to do 6 boards, but it can all fit efficiently in 3, then 3 is generally always better, generally. So that's one thing to be considered. The other is that if you have, let's say, hundreds of pages, right, because you want to create this Bible, that's your big idea with it, it's going to be hard for the employer to find the really important things, right, as opposed to a portfolio that maybe had 20 spreads. Well, those spreads are all going to be extremely important to you, and likely they're going to come across the important things because you've the chances are greater.
And that's where the discussion of sending work samples first and then sending portfolio when you made the first round of selection comes. Right? If you're not sending work samples, you're sending a portfolio directly to apply, then you should definitely limit yourself and make sure that what's in there is strong, like from any point in the portfolio. But if you're only sending work samples, then you get more play with the portfolio because they already ask you and selected you. Yeah.
And I think exhibiting your creative side and your creative thinking and your ability to uniquely problem solve something should come from the work itself that you did, the architecture, and not the book. And I think sometimes we feel pressure to apply that thinking to everything we do, and sometimes that's good, but in other times I think it's more of a distraction, I feel like. And so I wouldn't be concerned with that, with the design of the portfolio. I don't think anyone's going to be like, well, this portfolio is a little too basic and was not unique enough in the binding and cover, so I'm not going to hire them. No, if the work inside is good, they're going to hire you. They don't care about that. The other thing too is that it sounds dumb, but flipping through a bunch of pages takes effort. And again, the viewers, I wouldn't say they're lazy, but it's like they're not going to spend a lot of time, for something that might not pay off, because the level of commitment they have to the portfolio is going to depend. It happens in baby steps. Right. So the first time they see the portfolio, they've never met you. They don't know anything about you. They just need to know if they're going to want to interview you. And in that setting, they're not going to spend a lot of time reading it unless they have to happen to be hyper captivated. So they're not going to commit a bunch of time. So the action of flipping through a portfolio it can be exhausting. And when you get to the interview, it could be a problem, I think. Right. And I wonder if we should talk about the interview with the portfolio now, or no, let's do it later.
So what do you usually put in your portfolio?
Bananas.
Me too.
Scratch and sniff.
No, but I mean, is there things like you're like, nah, I don't need to put that in portfolio, or I definitely need to have that in there?
The one thing I never put in my portfolio is my resume. That's categorically something because it doesn't make sense. You keep it separate, and the resume is likely to change much more often than the portfolio. So keep it out. I've seen people print the resume inside the portfolio.
I had that for a while.
Yeah, I don't recommend it. Because you also have to think about the practicality of when you're going to apply jobs and et cetera, et cetera. Again, the resume is something that you're going to update fairly often, even cater toward the specific job you're going to. You're not going to create half a dozen different portfolios. So you want the freedom and the flexibility to have that.
My thinking was like, well, I know architects are a little messy. They got a lot of shit on their desk, and they're probably going to lose my resume or lose my portfolio. So if it's all together, they lose everything or they have everything.
No, I don't think that's a concern. I mean, because...
But yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to tailor a resume versus tailoring a portfolio to a particular
and then
place.
people like to print out resumes. I'll keep you can combine the cover letter and the resume into a single PDF if you want, but they should be kept separate from the portfolio or work samples file,
Did you ever have anyone writing on your portfolio?
No. Did you?
I don't think so, but...
No, because when you show up to the interview and you have the physical one, a lot of times it's quite nice and they're afraid to damage it because they know, okay, this kid spent probably a decent amount of money and time on this thing. I don't want to fuck it up in case he needs to use it for the next interview.
Except the guy who just squished my whole portfolio down.
Well, that's what you get for using perfect binding.
I was like, I do not want to work for that guy.
But outside of the resume, the question is, what projects do I include or not include, and do I include work other than architecture?
Well, duh.
No, duh what?
Duh, yeah. If you have other work that's good to show people, that shows different skills that you have, definitely include it. Not at the beginning, maybe, but include it somewhere in there. Yeah,
and I think that this gets to the first question which you have to ask yourself is, objectively, what would an employer want to see in a portfolio? Which is the same question as what would an employer what kind of person would they want to hire? What kind of attributes and qualities does this person have, right? Because again, the portfolio is a reflection of you.
Yeah, or what quality do I have that I think an employer would like to have?
Yeah. And so in that sense, the projects or the things that you include in the portfolio should show your different qualities as a person. This would include your skill set, your talents, and et cetera. So it could be anything from your leadership qualities or skills to innovation, responsibility, your technical skills, design skills, personality, or even self-motivation, right? And what's interesting is that of that list, these are not necessarily the first things a lot of architects would think about, would think about when including a project, right? These are not qualities you would attribute to a project that you designed, but these are the ones that employers are looking for to hire someone.
And actually, this list also applies to what's on the resume in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So again, this is like, hello, this is why I'm like a 5-star employee. Here you go again, just in case you missed it the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. And this highlights the difference between what most designers and architects focus on versus what they should be focusing on to get a job. And most of us prioritize the building and the design work itself, which is what we should be doing when we're producing it. But afterwards, it's not just about that stuff. Right.
Well, then again, the firm that's about to hire you, they don't care what building you did for what other architecture firm necessarily. It's like, what can I gain from having this person in my team? How could this person better the team I currently have, right? So what is this person's skills?
Yeah. That will help them. And I think the projects that we like, the projects that we did and we designed might not really matter to these people viewing it, right? You might like it for a very specific set of reasons. Unless those are things that they like, then you need to question whether or not it should be included or how it gets highlighted, right? And
that's why also, when you go through the interview and you talk about the projects that are in your portfolio, I think it's more interesting to talk about them as, your role in the project or what you think was challenging for you, or, like more of the overall about the project than actually talking about the aesthetics and the design of the project. Because they don't really care. They might not necessarily like it,
I think if you can, you include both. So what you're trying to do is present a well-rounded, highly desirable candidate, right? And you need to cover all the stuff I said, or try to, if you can, in the interview. And I think what you said also emphasizes that the portfolio in the interview is basically a presentation slideshow, and it's your bullet point list. It's your talking points, right? So this is another way to understand and design the portfolio. Again, it's not just a nice booklet, but it is a presentation to the person across from you, right? And you're presenting, again, all the qualities I mentioned. So the projects you include are kind of like an A team, and each one of them should be highlighting something very specific that you know is specific. So, and this is not necessarily limited to buildings. It could be competitions that you entered that were an art installation, not necessarily a building. So competitions, or you studying abroad if that had an impact on you and how you think, or even presenting at conferences. So the competition, the project itself might not be the most interesting. You might even hate the design, but if it's one that you did on your own, and even better if you won, well, that shows what? Self-motivation. They won something which is meaningful, even if it's not, but it is meaningful in terms of the packaging of it. So the qualifications for including which projects is not based on the design of the work or even the graphics necessarily, right?
Again, I don't think you should have all of the projects you've ever worked on to apply for a job, right? You kind of need, like you said, to make the A-team selection of project and select a project, each project for a very specific and different reason.
Yeah. And that's going to really help you, because in the interview, one of your major goals is to tell them how great you are, and again, talk about all the qualities you have. And if you have this competition that's sitting on the table between the two of you, now you can frame the conversation based on what you're seeing, and you tell them this is why it's important. Or if you include, a project you worked on at a previous office. This happened to be that I did not like the design, but I included it in there because it showed that I had worked and had experience on a certain scale of project, and I used certain programs, right? And if you were to look at it aesthetically, you'd say, oh, why is this person putting this in this portfolio? But when I'm sitting across from the interviewer, I tell them, I put this here to show I know these things. I mean, I phrase it in a slightly different way, but that's the context, right? And then if I'm concerned about showing my design skills, that's the next project or the next 3 projects.
And that goes back to the selection of which project should you put in your portfolio. Like I said, I don't think you should put all of the projects in it, but I don't also think that you cannot not use all of the projects. Meaning, all of the project, there is something that you could exploit, that you could use, right? You just need to, it might not need to be like all of the images you have about that project. It might be like this project, that particular detail was very interesting. Or this one, we did an amazing job with the side plan. Or this one, we did a crazy renderings at nighttime, And like each things are showing different things. And that's also where the selection is a big part at which project you're selecting, and then which image for each of those projects you are selecting.
Right. And I think this bleeds over to the question of whether or not you include things that are not strictly architecture or even close to it. And it's a case-by-case basis, but I think if there's a strong argument to include a particular skill set or event or whatever on one of your spreads, because it shows something about you as a person that's highly desirable, then I think it's fine to include it, right?
Yeah, I think it is. And as long as the quality of the presentation of it is to the same level as the rest of your portfolio, it's completely okay. If you have like some like crappy doodles on like, a piece of newspaper you do in the subway every morning, I mean, that would actually be very interesting. But, like, it cannot look neglected as like, oh, and also I have a couple of stuff you might want to see. It needs to be like, and also I would like you to take a look at that because I think it's relevant. And
sometimes what I would do in the past is all of my portfolios were structured that each spread was a single project or 2 spreads was a project, right? And that was the format. And I would allocate a spread at the end for all this miscellaneous stuff that showed something about me but didn't have enough weight to occupy 2 pages. So I'd have a grid or some layout of miscellaneous things that show like I know carpentry, I know woodworking, I don't know what else did I have, whatever other things. Right, I'm a musician and things like this. And I think it's okay. I think the only thing to be mindful of is, again, the balance between that stuff and the architecture. Because if we're going for a fairly middle-of-the-road firm, like we are being hired to be an architect and work on things like this. So, again, it's a balancing act. But the advantage of putting in these other things is that I think you're more likely to stand out and you're more likely to be unique. Because I do think that most portfolios don't actually, most designers don't think about the portfolio the way we're talking about it in terms of personal attributes. And this is a huge detriment to the portfolio. And if you think this way, you include these other kinds of things, I think 1, it's going to make you more desirable, period. And then 2, you're probably going to stand out.
You're going to stand out. And again, it's not something that is mandatory or required, but the fact that you thought about adding it, I think is making you, coming out of the pie a little bit.
So what are your thoughts about redoing old work, which you see quite often?
I mean, if it's like changing a color on a diagram so it works better with the other images on that spread, it's more homogeneous, like totally fine with it. If it's like redesigning the building because you were not happy of the design you did in your 3rd year in school, I think that's stupid. And again, it goes back to what we were saying about the fact that it's not necessarily about the aesthetic of the project. That's not why you're going to be hired. Oh, you work on this beautiful building and I love it, so I'm going to hire you. That's not what people are going to hire you, right? They're going to hire you because of your skills and like all of the things you could do.
And how you can think.
And how you can get to that and not because of that result. So I think it's silly.
Yeah, something you said earlier, I think is appropriate to this part of the conversation. You said that you have to communicate that you're open basically to learning new things to work with this office. And I think in that sense, the portfolio needs to communicate that that you have grown and that you're willing to grow. And so if I open up a portfolio and there's 10 projects and they all look like they were rendered by the same program by the same person within the same 2 weeks, this is very disturbing. One, I know it's dishonest. Two, it's a very limited outlook about architecture and design and working in an office and et cetera, et cetera. But I think maybe there's a fear of including stuff that doesn't look good, right?
Well, yeah, and I mean, but that's what architecture is about, from school to presenting to clients, right? It's like you never know that you're gonna please everyone, and you're not gonna do stuff that's perfect from the beginning to the end, and that's okay to accept it. I've seen portfolio like that when like graduating student portfolio, and they spend the whole summer before applying to jobs, like redoing all of their projects from first year to fifth year. And it's like, yeah, but I actually don't know where you came from, like where you started. Mm-hmm. I just see you as now redoing all of those exercises perfectly,
right?
Instead of seeing you trying to understand how to do those exercises.
Yeah, and I like the idea that the portfolio is a story, and if you order it, which we'll get into later in a somewhat chronological way, it'll be very clear to the viewer that this project was done in second year or whatever, right? Or it was done in fourth year. This project was done 5 years after they graduated, and it was done by a different firm, and they had their own rendering team. So there's not this. The thing is, in school, everything comes down to the graphics, in the sense that's the only way things are communicated, and everything is judged through the graphics. And that's totally appropriate in some ways. But when we get to the professional setting, we all understand there are other factors that come into play. And one of them is that we all grow and evolve. So if I see a project that was clearly done in school, but it's kind of like, this rendering sucks, I don't hold it against the person, right? Assuming that later on I see that the rendering's improved, right? Or even if they have a project that did recently, it was done at X name firm, I don't like the rendering graphic style, I don't hold it against the person. I don't expect them to re-render it. I get that what they gained from this experience was not rendering, because this office had their own style. So I think it's more important to exhibit the honest story that you've been through.
I was just gonna say, I would always promote honesty versus like trying to guess what the other person wants.
Right.
It's like, it's also kind of like, you take me as I am or you don't, and that's it. But I think, I think I can understand how students do that when they graduate, because there is a lack of confidence. In the same time, I don't think they should pretend to be at the level at which they're not yet. Or they have not been when they started.
Yeah, or the thing to do is, if you, again, different projects communicate different things, and if you want to show that you have really good skill sets in terms of graphic representation of things, and you want to fix something, then at the very least fix the most recent project, but don't fix everything. It's unnecessary, and it's wrong, and it conveys the wrong things, and it's not. Of course, and we're not advocating for having a shitty portfolio. If all of your work sucks, then again, like I said, it's a trend. Yeah,
if you're a lazy student in school and you didn't do shit, then you probably should work on it.
Then screw off. You shouldn't be listening to this podcast. So I think that's really important to be said, because it's a common mistake. The other thing, more specific questions of how much text do I include? Now, are you an advocate for a lot of text?
It's like presentation boards. And like you said, presentation board and portfolio and resume, to me, it's a cheat sheet of the stuff you're supposed to do and say, but not everything.
Right.
Like, you need to leave gaps so you can bring things once you meet the person and talk about the project. If you're just regurgitating everything that you've already wrote about the project, then what is the point of meeting, right? So I'm kind of usually keeping a little bit of information out. So when I meet them, they feel like they learn more stuff than they did just by looking at the portfolio.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see the advantage of leaving a little bit of gaps as you put a little bit of space in there. But I also think that it assumes that they're going to have read the portfolio.
And that's the other thing. They're most likely going to read one paragraph of your whole portfolio,
if that,
at best. Yeah. What they might do is look at the titles, maybe. But I wouldn't spend a huge amount of time working on text.
So here's why I would disagree with that. I think the idea that because they're not going to read it, therefore you don't include a decent paragraph of text, would make sense in some ways. So let's get more specific. So let's say 11-point font. It's roughly a couple inches wide and, I don't know, 4 inches tall. Like, that's a decent paragraph of text, right? A lot of people would say don't include it for the reasons just mentioned. But I think, first of all, even if they don't read it, the fact that you have text for every single project does, yes, agree, does communicate this person actually has something to say about these things and they put some thought into it. Even if they don't read it, it gives the illusion is not the right word, but it gives the appearance and the accurate representation of the fact that you have something to say.
No, I'm not saying you shouldn't have any text. I think you should have some text, and you should have some text that's not like, oh, here I wanted to have a green roof because I think plants are great and smells good.
Yeah.
Like your text should be sharp and intelligent and pertinent to that specific project. But because of the fact that you are somewhat constrained on how many pages you can allow per project, you kind of need to gauge, do I should have more text for this one, or more images, or bigger images, or,
Yeah. I think the other advantage of having full body text for me is that I think you do have to spend time writing it, like actually writing it, because basically it's going to be what you say during the interview. And I think it's a good exercise to go through, period. And if you're going to go through it, then you might as well put it in the portfolio. The other advantage is then when you're preparing for the interview, and the good strategy is always get there or across the street to the Starbucks half an hour early to kind of settle down and let the nerves settle and start preparation.
Just use the bathroom.
Just use that too, yeah. Let it out now. Is that you can read the text you went through. So for me, I would get there half an hour early, sit down at the cafe, and my preparation for the interview is just reading my portfolio. It's all there. All the stuff that I want to say, more or less, is there. And it's a great thing. And also when you're presenting, it's in front of you.
I don't do that.
Why not?
I don't fully write everything I'm gonna say because it's
well, maybe not to that extreme.
You love writing, so you
I hate writing.
No, but you do like writing.
No,
I don't write everything I'm gonna say, and I really use keywords in the text,
sure,
or titles on the page. It's almost like I'm hiding a bunch of hints of what I'm supposed to talk about on the spread, right?
Yeah.
Or even the images, the order the images are laid out on the page. I know I'm going to go from like here to there to there to that.
Sure. Let me revise then. Maybe what you could do, let me revise what I said. So if for a certain project and a certain spread that's being displayed between the two of you, you have a list of things you want to say, and it has to do with your leadership qualities and your ability to lead, be part of a group, etc. Maybe that you don't put in the text, but if you write down what the project is about, like the design of it, at the very least, that'll allow you to know the projects, because sometimes it'll be quite a big gap between interviews, right? And when you're at the interview, you don't know which project you're going to stick on. I've had, like, sometimes, I have 5 big ones. Like, these are the ones I want to talk about, and they look the best, so I know we're going to talk about them. Sometimes they focus on one thing. I'm like, I don't want to talk about this. And it's like, I don't even remember what I did for this because it was so long ago, and I haven't done an interview recently, right? So having the text that clearly describes the project or why it's interesting, et cetera, is really helpful.
Yeah, I don't need that.
Well, okay.
I don't remember what I've done for projects. I don't need that.
And that also gets to another thing, which is doing the portfolio is a really a painful process because you're having to go through with a fine-tooth comb, similar to the resume, and figure out all the different things you've done, which ones would be included and why and what you would say. Like it's a pretty intense thing to go through.
And you have to look at it over and over and over again. Every time you want to switch job, it's like, oh, I'm going to have to look at those crappy projects again.
And at the end of the day, if you are a good designer, it is a lot of information. So I don't know. I think having long form text, there are definitely advantages to it, even if no one is ever going to read it. You're going to read it potentially, right?
Well, I think it's good to have just... like you said, for even if it's just in your InDesign file, on the side, it's not even on the page, but it's there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is a good idea to write down everything you can remember about the project, right? Because over the years, you're going to revise your portfolio. You might want to switch what type of information you're actually talking about. Right? If you want to become like really technical about materials you've used or like, certain things like that, you might not remember unless you go dig into the project folder and all that kind of stuff.
So lastly, with project content, the question of including images that are not mine. Yes, absolutely include them. Just give credit to the firm that you worked at or the photographer, and that's what it is. Now, including images that are meant to be confidential is another question. And legally speaking, officially on this podcast, we will say do not use those images because they're not meant for the public. However, there are advantages to using those images if they accurately describe the project or convey or display parts that you worked on. Then I could see why you would want to include them, but you shouldn't. But be mindful of that. If you do include the stuff that you're not supposed to, then you have to, at the very least, don't be emailing out it to the world or sending out links that anyone can find and stuff like this. Like you should.
I think if you sometimes in offices you have to sign an agreement, a confidentiality agreement. If you sign one of those, I would just don't use those images until it's on Curbed or like online, like it's been published. Then like the project is out there. Before that, you gotta respect the confidentiality. Yeah,
and that's a line that people like to blur, and it's understandable. But another way to look at it is that the person you're interviewing with is going to be your next employer, and they're going to. If you're doing a bunch of shady stuff with your previous office, it tells them that you're going to do the same thing with them, probably, because it's likely that's not the final office you're going to stay with for the rest of your life. And so this is another thing, right? It's the same thing as you never, ever badmouth a previous office because it tells them what you're going to say about their office when you leave.
And we will develop that in the interview episode. Yes. Very good point.
Okay, I think I had too much coffee because I'm kind of jittery and I'm speaking a little bit too fast.
You speak really fast. It's like you're
I know.
You want to get out of here?
No, I had too much coffee, so I'm going to try and slow down. The layout of project. What? The
layout of projects.
Shut up. The layout of projects. What? Come on. What? And
I know you're like,
I had
everybody. How much coffee did you have?
Too much. I overcompensated. I was falling asleep. Allergies are terrible, so I took 3 cups.
Oh, that's a lot at the same time.
Okay, so what are your thoughts about the layout? This is a very specific thing to discuss.
The layout? What do you mean?
The layout.
I mean, the layout is a very personal thing.
So I think in general, a point that you brought up before is you have to consider the rhythm of the portfolio.
Oh, yeah.
And when you're going through it, and that you don't want it to be boring, which then translates back to the idea of having mixing it up in terms of how content is laid out and mixing content. The same way you design a board, it's pretty much understood. It's generally good to have mixed content.
Or a magazine. Like,
okay.
No, but again, right? In a magazine, there is different types of pages. There is like full spreads, advertisement, text articles, like, different image here, image there. So you can have those types of pages, templates, but you kind of have to punctuate it in a way that it's not boring.
Yeah. There needs to be a rhythm, and I like the idea of having layouts to communicate the projects, and fewer pages is my personal preference. preference. One, because again, going back to the issue of how many pages you have, that addresses that concern and better ensures they land on something important. Two, I like the idea that when they get to something, they can just sit on that and look at it for a few minutes and understand the project. And also, I think it's good because it shows your ability to do a layout, which is not an easy thing to do if it's a full building that has different kinds of drawings and contents and diagrams and renderings, right? That the ability to, you're looking at me as if you don't know what I'm talking about.
What do you exactly mean with the word layout? I'm a bit confused right now.
So you have a spread, 2 pages, and you have to put all the content about the project on that. Then you're doing a layout. You're laying out the work.
But that's what a portfolio exercise is, right?
Not necessarily. I mean, you could do it so you have 1 image per page.
Oh, you mean also okay, yeah.
Which is also considered a layout, but this is the distinction.
Yeah, that's why I was confused.
Yeah, so this is the distinction I'm making between more of a board layout where there's a lot of content on 1 page or more content versus on the extreme end, 1 image per page. And I think the advantage of putting more content on a single page or single spread is all the stuff I just listed, and it shows you have the skill set to do it, which is not an easy thing to do. And the 1 image per page, I think can be good in terms of setting a different rhythm, kind of like a landing point, right? But the danger is if you do only that, again, this issue of rhythm. Now you've created a monotony, and also, honestly, I think a lot. It's kind of arrogant, depending on the work. Like a lot of younger designers do this, and it's kind of like, well, the image is not that interesting or that great. It doesn't really deserve 1 spread. It's not like a Rothko.
Well, I'm glad we're doing this episode together because everything you really don't like, that's what I've been doing so far. So.
But you know what I mean? I'm not saying this is the only way 1 image per page is viewed, but that's I think, for me at least, if I see a lot of it, it's like, all right, you know, they're trying to make it in like this nice, beautiful painting that has a lot of white space, but it's not that great.
Well, if you're picking the wrong image to do that, yeah, it's definitely a bad move. But if you have a great drawing or a great image, why not? As long as it's not every page is like that, I think it's fine.
The other advantage of having 1 spread, using only 1 spread or 2 to communicate an entire project, is that if you say, okay, I anticipate the partner to flip through and see 5 different spreads, his first pass, right? He's going to see then potentially 5 different projects and 5 different qualities of view, right? Your attributes. If it takes you 20 pages to do 1 project, he might only see 1 or 2 projects, which might not be an accurate cross-section of who you are or a robust enough cross-section of who you are to get you to the interview. Do you know what I mean?
To get you to the interview.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which goes back to the work samples.
Right. The other thing, too, with the layouts is that when you're at the interview and you're talking about the work, you don't want to be having to flip through like 20 pages because it's really difficult to do in the setting of the person's far away from you or whatever. You don't know what page they're on and there's different people viewing. You don't want to be flipping through this thing. If you can kind of open it up and it's on one thing, it sits for a bit of time, I think this is advantageous for those reasons.
But going back to like the fact that you don't like having 1 image per page and all of that floating spaces and how pretentious it could be and all that stuff, I think it also goes the same way if a page is too full with stuff. It's hard to see what is important, which image should I be looking at. Like this person wasn't able to select the most important information. They just crammed as much stuff as they could on the page, you know? And if each spread is like that, it's kind of intense and kind of tiring. And even if there are like 10 different projects, it's like you can't really, there is no hierarchy in the information.
Well, I think that comes down to, in a way, then what you would end up doing is creating rhythm within each page, right? So that's where, again, you have to be good at doing a layout. You just have to have hierarchy with it. You have to set up pace and tempo and landing points and bigger images and small images in the layout itself. So in a way, it's kind of like a micro version of 20 pages, but it takes skill to do that, and it's not easy.
It's a micro version of the 20 pages, but you see it all at once.
Yeah, so it's challenging, and have a mixture then.
Oh, it is more challenging because of the fact that you're seeing it all at once.
Yeah. Okay. Alrighty then. We're making our way through.
Oh, thank God.
I know.
I thought I was going to be done with doing portfolios. I'm talking about them.
This is the advantage of doing this, is now we can just forward people to this recording and not have to talk about it again. On the subject of organizing the projects, do you do chronological ordering, et cetera, et cetera?
Do you do chronological ordering?
Huh?
Do you do that?
I was hoping to ask you the question.
Too bad.
I know you can categorize things in different ways in architecture, like materiality or big, little, small, or scale, or whatever. I tend to have always done the reverse chronological order. So most recent stuff at the beginning and the older stuff at the back, roughly. I think this is nice because it's a very clear narrative of who I am, where I am now, where I've been, and where I'm going to be potentially in the future. And you get to see the most important stuff at the beginning, which is typically where you start. I do make exceptions with that because you have to understand the book as 3 distinct parts of beginning, middle, and end, and you want strong projects, or strong layouts, we should say, because it might not be a project, at the beginning, middle, and end. So if I have a really shitty project I did way earlier on, I will make sure I don't end on that. I put something at the end that gives a good note. And that's basically how I've always ordered things. So I don't think I've ever, or maybe I did that for a little bit. I think it's interesting because, they're most likely going to look at the first pages of your portfolio, which is you now, right? Like what you've been doing right now. And kind of going backwards, ending with who you started with and how you started with. I think it's interesting because they might not get to the end. So even if they skip it, they still saw like the most important chunk of the portfolio. Yeah. And if they do get to the end, they maybe end on a note that is more personal about the work you've been doing. That's interesting,
and a little less about who you are now as a professional, which is interesting. I didn't do that for my last one. I think I did different types of scale of projects from furniture to interior to towers to like different stuff. So I think I organized it based on scale, like zooming in and out of things.
And that's a valid way to do it too, because you're creating clarity, right? Sometimes it's a bit jarring to go from an urban design project and a building and then interior design and then urban design. It's a little bit much. And that could be also good if the viewer knows that they're more interested in certain kinds of things. They're going to flip to that tab or that chapter and find what you have there. So I could see the benefit of that, yeah.
But it all also depends on the content of project that you have, right? And that really dictates.
And it doesn't have to be a strict reverse chronological order. There could be exceptions, but maybe like these 2 projects were done within 2 years. You can swap them. It's roughly what it is. Table of contents, that's good to have if it's worthwhile having. I mean, I don't think it's a make or break deal. I think what's more important though is having labels and highlights. So this gets to the issue of clarity in the portfolio, which perhaps we haven't talked about much. Again, it's not just about communicating the project. It's about communicating all the stuff around the project and why it's important for you and why they would want to hire you. So having giant labels or bold font or whatever that clearly describes what the project is. I know we like these color codes. I know we like these more academic, cool, wonky names of like roboticisms and heterogeneutopias and dystopian societies of futures. Like, okay, fine, whatever. But what the fuck am I actually looking at? An art installation. Okay, good. Right. So I think you do need to understand that. And also the kind of long verbiage is maybe not is not accurately portraying why that project is important for hiring purposes. And on that, you need to list very clearly in large, legible font the basic stats. Like, okay, what is it? Homeless shelter. Fine, I get it. You have some other weird ass title. I'm going to read that maybe, but I get it's a homeless shelter. Where's this homeless shelter? When was it done? How big is it? Right. And then other things.
How big is it?
Other things of why it's important. If it's a competition, you should probably write down in big font that it was a competition. If you won the competition, put that in giant gold leaf letters that you won the competition, right? I think maybe it's difficult for us to market ourselves sometimes because we're not used to it. It feels icky. But this is how people are hired.
I mean, that's how you get the job, right?
That's how you get the job.
The other thing is, if you've worked on a different scale of projects, like one you were managing the project, another one you were the lead designer, another one you were part of a team of 30 people working on a project, like you gotta mention those information because I am sure that an employer looking at it will pay very good attention to that kind of information.
Absolutely. More so than the project. And the project itself, the building itself, does not contain that information. It doesn't tell them anything about that stuff. And you have to spoon feed it to them, and you have to make it big and bold and really in your face, right? And I think this is something I don't see in portfolios often, but it's really, really crucial. It's really crucial. What other kinds of things could you highlight? Did you start an association that led to a nonprofit that led to this or that because of this project? If that's the most important thing, then write that down somewhere in giant font, right? Is it the fact that you became an expert at a certain piece of software? And I don't know why that would be important, but if you did that, then write that down.
Or the project you work on was like a LEED Gold building or something, anything that represent some kind of value and evaluation criteria.
And in a way that's easily memorable and packageable and stands out. That's what it needs to be: short and concise and clear. And this will alone separate you from everyone else, because there's a lot of really talented designers out there who have won a bunch of awards. The question is whether or not the viewer is going to even know they won those awards, which is, of course, how you design the portfolio. And And it's the stuff that's easy to remember is what makes a difference in how people value potential candidates, right? It's like, these two candidates, they all had weird abstract stuff, but that person had a big gold star. He won something. Let's talk to him. All right. Printing issues. I mean, you can print online. I think the negatives of doing that, going through some of these websites, is that you're probably going to get a product that looks like all other stuff that they make, and this is something to be aware of.
Yeah, or again, if you're not reinventing the way, I've done that for pretty much all of my portfolio, and I think that it was fine.
Other things under printing, just basic things. You got to do a test print. Most places will do a test print for you. Check the resolution of your images too. Like, it's awful when you see a nice printed portfolio and like the image is like all pixelated or all weird. Basic things, margins, leave more margins because the cropping is never perfect. Beware of lead times. That always seems to be a problem. And then not lastly, but when you're at the interview, what happens at the interview with the portfolio?
Will you take it back? I used to ask that question. I was like, do you guys want to hold on to that, or want me to take it back? Because if they're going to throw it away, I might as well just save myself spending another, $40 per portfolio. You know what I mean?
And there might be two different versions that you have. You might have the printed version that you send out to 10 different places, and you might have one where you spend a little more money, you put like a thicker cover on it or something like this that you take with you from place to place. I mean, I don't know. It's a lot of effort to me to make two different ones, but this is a possibility. And I would emphasize to design the portfolio based on what happens at the interview. So you're sitting across from them. They're going to flip through it. You might have control of the pages, or they might. And really, that's where it gets tested, right? Digital version. So going back to that, I do make a distinction between portfolio and work samples. When you send work samples, which is like a abbreviated or slightly different version of your portfolio via email, it should be, as of now, roughly under 4 megabytes always. Don't push that boundary. It's not worth it. Also, don't send them the full portfolio. It's not necessary.
It's like you're giving them an appetizer, right? You're not going to give them the whole turkey. You're going to give them a little slider. They're going to like it. And then you're going to give them the whole turkey. But the whole point is to hook them enough to make them interested enough in you that they want to see more or they want to have you come in. That's the only goal by sending stuff, right?
Yeah, so...
Otherwise, they're just going to judge you without giving you a chance to come in person or explain what you just sent, which isn't fair.
So the work samples might be selected pages from your portfolio, or it might be not completely, but like a redesigned version of it,
Formatted differently.
Formatted slightly differently. You want to make the work samples easily printable, so don't send like a 24 by 36 or some 6 by 6 size. Again, they're going to print 8.5 by 11, so something around that would make sense. Also, I think you see this in young designers especially. They have giant file sizes, and a lot of them feel like 4 megabytes. That's impossible. No, it's not. It's not impossible. First of all, if you have a lot of vector work, rasterize that shit, okay? Because if you have a lot of vector work, it creates really heavy files, and also it looks inaccurate on the screen. It looks like this really heavy line weight.
It takes time to load.
It takes time to load, and you don't know the computer software they have. It might not be as good as yours, the hardware rather. So I rasterize the images always, and if the things are a little bit blurry, it's fine. They're going to view it on an iPad, maybe even on an iPhone or the computer, and they know it's 4 megabytes. They know it's a work samples. They're not going to judge you and say, wow, this rendering is kind of blurry. No, it's a work sample, right? And even if that means some of the text is not fully legible for the really specific detailed stuff, ideally you don't want that, but it's not the worst thing, right? If they can read the big, important stuff.
Yeah, I mean, just rasterize your images, and when you export the PDF from InDesign, you can select the type of compression of images, the quality and all that. So just play with that kind of settings and come up to something that's reasonable.
And be aware of, I think sending links to online websites is something that people do, and I feel like people did more often previously. There's a lot of firms now who explicitly say, don't send us links to, let's say, issue.com, ISSUU, or whatever else. I don't know why they don't like that, but they say just don't do it. I think probably because people upload really heavy PDFs to those websites, and they just don't want the hassle of it, right?
So
that makes sense.
How often do you update your portfolio?
Only when I'm looking for a job.
We see.
What?
See, I think it's already too late.
Why?
I know I have an old coworker actually who was a little on the opposite side, and he was constantly updating his portfolio. So like today he could send a portfolio, get a job tomorrow. Like he's ready. Just a little extreme.
That's a bit extreme.
It's a bit extreme, but I would recommend, even if you're not working on updating your layout and things like that, I think at least thinking about what images or documents you would eventually use for that project you're working on for your next portfolio. Just so, if you switch office, or if the project doesn't go through, or if the server gets erased, or, anything, you have some kind of documentation, or you don't have to go through all of your folders to find that images that you absolutely wanted to use.
No, that I agree with, but that's not, so I would say you should back up work that you've been working on and storing it on a hard drive and taking it from the office and etc. pretty often. But in terms of like actually going in and like working on the portfolio and doing layouts, I don't do that unless I need to, because it's not fun.
Yeah, no, don't do that. I mean, don't do that. But I'm just saying like, just think about the stuff you think would be worth to be in a portfolio at some point.
Right.
Just so you can work on that on the side.
Yeah.
Without, working on your portfolio every night after going back from work.
No, that's crazy. Also, that puts you in the wrong mindset, and then
It's not good.
So I think we pretty much covered everything. I'm sure there's things we've discussed before and left out because there's many things to cover. If there's any other questions you guys have, you should just reach out to us and about portfolios, and we'll talk about it. So I guess in summary, there's a few key points to take away. The first is that you really have to think about why you're making a portfolio, and the answer is to get hired, and therefore you think about when and how the portfolio is going to be reviewed and by who.
And ultimately, what position are you looking to get hired for?
Yeah.
Are you looking to get hired as an interior designer, but you were doing architecture work? Are you looking to get hired as a manager and you were a drafter?
Yeah. So I think the issues of clarity is really important, and one that we forget about because we tend to prioritize cute aesthetics and weird names over clarity. But no, be really clear with what projects are, and also including work, not necessarily projects. And work and life events that communicate why you are a desirable candidate, right? This is a different way to view the portfolio than most do.
And if you want us to coach you for your portfolio, we take about $10,000 each to review and help you out. So feel free to reach out.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this week's episode of the Midnight Charette. We say it every week, but we really do appreciate it. And if you like what we are doing, then please show us your love and support by leaving us a review in the podcast app. We are, of course, in iTunes, Spotify, and now YouTube. Subscribe on YouTube and leave a review there if you can. We have a website. It is midnightcharette.com, where we have all of our previous 113 episodes. And if you're looking for episodes that are specifically helpful guides to things, such as what architecture school to choose, or creating a resume, or how to apply for jobs, then you should definitely go to our website and look under the tips and tactics category. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We have a Facebook group that's going on. Reach out to us through any of those platforms or via email with hello@midnightcharette.com if you have any topics that you think we should discuss or guests that we should interview. Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week or sooner.